Okay, welcome back to week 2 of how to be a person after God's own heart. Today we're going to just jump in and talk about a topic that I think sometimes really we struggle in. Like this could be one that when we think like, man, we're a person after God's own heart. This is one of those areas that can really make us stumble or we could struggle in. So we're talking about David. We're now entered into 2 Samuel. And for the rest of the month, we're going to be talking about, for the rest of this series, we're just going to be talking about 2 Samuel. We're going to be diving in and just investigating more and more and discovering more and more how can we be a person after God's own heart. Where we pick up this story is Saul has just been killed, but David doesn't know yet. And we're starting 2 Samuel. And before we do that, I want to ask you a question. Can you think about a time, or can you think about a person who's wronged you? Who's done something that's hurt you, who's betrayed you? It's just something that's wronged you. Now, I want you to just take a couple minutes, think about what emotions you're feeling right now. Or maybe some words that you are thinking in your head right now that you probably don't want to say out loud. Those are real things. Those are real emotions and real feelings. And I invite you to just bring those to God. Don't try to stuff them down. Don't try to say, oh, I shouldn't be thinking these things. Whether that's true or not, that's not the point. The point is you want to help let God heal those. But in connection with this week, I want to invite you, I want you just to sit for a couple seconds as we dive into the emotions you're feeling, to the situations you've walked through where people have hurt you. Because David has been accused, has been tracked down, has been hunted, has been tried to be killed many times by Saul. So in 2 Samuel, Saul is dead. And this is David's response. So here's what happens. We're not going to read a lot together, but I invite you individually to read 2 Samuel 1-6. And we're just going to highlight a couple things of how we can be people after God's own heart in the midst of division. Because David's life was in the middle of division. He was still, at this point, he felt like he was being hunted. The kingdom was divided. There was people who were for him, people who were against him, people who were trying to figure him out. There was not much solid with David, but there was a lot of division around him. So the first thing I think we can learn from this story, that I think if we want to really dive in and become people after God's own heart in division, is we can see how David responded in 2 Samuel 1 when he was notified that Saul was dead. And it probably would surprise you, because if you read through this is what happens. This guy comes running. He goes, hey, good news, David. I want to share this good news with you. He goes, Saul is dead. And in fact, I'm the one who killed him, because let me tell you the story. He was already mortally wounded, and he came to me and he said, hey, please kill me so that the enemy doesn't take me. And so I killed him. And David, I just wanted to share that with you and let you know that that's what happened. And if you read David's response, it's very interesting, because even in the midst of division, here's point 1. If we want to be people after God's own heart in division, David showed respect for Saul and for the position of king. Like God had appointed Saul as king, and David said, hey, how dare you? How dare you, guy? You just killed the king who was anointed by God. So David held respect for Saul and held respect for a guy who had wronged him, who had caused so much hurt and pain in his life. He still held respect and really held up the position of king. And you can read more about that and what David did to the guy. It's just a reflection of how we can respond to become people after God's own heart in division, is continue to respect the people around us. Number 2, in 2 Samuel 2, all of a sudden, all this turmoil is happening, and David asked God, where should I go? What's next? So he asked God. So the second thing I would encourage you to do if you want to be a person after God's own heart in division is to ask God. And God said, hey, go here. And he found out and he had this conversation, and these were people who treated Saul's body with respect. So again, in the midst of division, in the midst of having this past pain against Saul, he went and honored the group of people. He asked God, and then he went and honored the group of people who treated Saul's body with respect, like a king's body should have been respected. And he honored them and respected them and thanked them. Again, very unusual, very unexpected, probably from the people of that day. They probably would have said, well, what do you, like, wasn't he your enemy? Didn't he do all these wrong things? And why are you wanting to respect him? So think through your relationships, your division in your life. How do you continue to show up and ask God? But then also, how do you respect? How do you listen and ask God and then follow through? The third thing that I think we could learn is how to follow God in the midst of division. As you read 2 Samuel, finish 2, going to 3, and going into 4, there's lots of division that's happening, and lots of like people trying to take sides and people trying to take control and power over the Israelites. And David only has partial control. He's only king of part of the Israelites for years. And then at the end of chapter 4, into 5, we find that David becomes king over all of Israel. And he's arrived. Like all of the division seems to be settled, but yet, oh yeah, there's one more thing. The arch enemy Philistines are coming at him. And David, again, in the midst of division, goes to God and says, hey God, what do you want me to do? And if you read through chapter 5, it's interesting because he asks God, what should I do? And God said, should I go to war with him? And God goes, yes. And then there's a little bit of a respite. And then the Philistines come again. And David asks again. He just doesn't assume that this is what God wanted him to do. He says, okay, God, what do you want me to do? Do you want me to go out and attack? And he goes, God goes, hey, this time I want you to circle around. And in that following of God, the Philistines are completely annihilated. And for a long, long season, they never bug David or the Israelites. But in division, David had to choose to follow God. David had to choose to ask God again, like not just assume that, oh, that was God's answer back then. It's probably the same way he wants me to handle it now. See, character will never change, but his responses to our pain and our frustration and our situation may. Meaning he may ask you to invite and engage people differently. So if we want to be people after God's own heart, we want to constantly be asking God, how does he want us to show up to people? And how does he want us to show up and respond to people? Because it may be, the way of doing that may be different. He may invite us at different seasons to engage differently, but his character will never change. So if you want to be a person after God's own heart, if we want to dive in here, we want to really, really, really try hard to show respect to the people that frustrate us, to ask God for direction, to then follow up with God and follow God, whatever he tells us to do, but then again, constantly follow up with God. And lastly, if you read 2 Samuel 6, it is just this great story of a little bit of craziness, a little bit of celebration, because the Ark of the Covenant gets to come to Jerusalem. And the Ark of the Covenant, and David gets to bring it, and he is so excited, and there's so much celebration, and finally and there's problems along the way, but finally they're entering in, and David just lets loose, and he goes, I am going to celebrate this goodness. Now, it doesn't come with some people going like, hey, why are you celebrating goodness? Like, why are you celebrating like that? Like, you are the king, you shouldn't go that crazy. But there's this truth about if we want to be people after God's own heart in the middle of division, we want to celebrate the good. Because in all of the division, there is still good things to celebrate. David shows us over and over again that if we want to be people after God's own heart, that there are ways to do it. There are practices we can practice. I invite you to dive in. There's so much rich stuff. There's so much stuff to uncover and unpack in our own hearts about how do we allow ourselves to not let pain, frustration, division lead our decisions, but let this maybe pattern of how to be people after God's own heart. By respecting people around us, by asking God what's next, by then following what God tells us to do, and then continuing to follow him, and finally just celebrate the goodness. Well, I encourage you to jump in, have some great conversations, see what the Holy Spirit might reveal to you on what your next step is.